Welcome to Dispatches, the official podcast for the Journal of the American Revolution. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Our guest today is Journal of the American Revolution contributor Bob Walworth, and he'll be discussing a border dispute between the colonies of Vermont and New York. Bob, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Brady. It's a pleasure to join you on Dispatches today.
Bob, you're a first-time guest. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a graduate of Oakland University here in Michigan. Recently retired CPA after a 40-year career in forensic accounting. I provided expert financial testimony in court over 100 times in my career. The work was investigative in nature, gathering relevant data, formulating opinions that were subject to cross-examination. I have found that these skills and techniques translated well to the study of history. I've always been a history buff, but had not done any real serious historical research. That changed about 13 years ago, and I began to get into the history of my family, who first came over from England in 1689. Came across a couple of published genealogical books of the family. And as I started to get into them and analyze them, I found a number of interesting references to the Revolutionary War. I read about a Walworth who was a Green Mountain boy who was with Ethan Allen at the taking of Ticonderoga in 1775. Another who fought in the Battle of New York in 76. Many who were at the Battle of Bennington in 1777. Some who were casualties of the Battle of Wyoming in 1778. Another who was a participant at the Battle of Minisink Ford in 1779. And in 1781, one Walworth was a casualty at the Battle of Fort Griswold, where Benedict Arnold had led the British Army against the American forces there. So this really started to capture my interest, all these interesting things going on in the family during the Revolutionary War. And I began to study the events a little more deeply and started to work on a book that would cover the family's history there from about 1750 through the end of the Revolutionary War.
Okay, Bob. So, Bob, tell us what inspired you to write this article?
Well, as I started to dive into the history here, started to find out about why the family ended up in these places during the war. And what I found was a lot of land struggles. About 1750, the family had been in Groton, Connecticut since they had come over from England. But they were starting to face land pressures, as were many in the area. The generational division of lands contributed to that. Large families, increased population, increased immigration still going on. And it was reducing the amount of available land in Connecticut and in the area, so they started to look out to the frontier. And as they started to move out to the frontier, they first went to Dutchess County, New York, ended up at the Wyoming Valley, and in the New Hampshire Grants area. What they all had in common was a high degree of violence that occurred during that time. In 1766, there were land riots in Dutchess County as the settlers pushed back against the landlords, the tenant farmers there. There were some border disputes between New York and Massachusetts involved in the same time frame. Starting in 1769, Connecticut and Pennsylvania were fighting over the same land in the Wyoming Valley. And in 1769, the battle or the struggle in the Hampshire Grants came to a head. And I had a couple of ancestors on each side there. One was a Green Mountain boy, and one was a Yorker. So as I started to dive into that, I started to really dig into the details of this land dispute between New York and New Hampshire.
Yeah, Bob. Now, this is something that we see a lot in colonial America, these land disputes between colonies, not really on the same page. Were they common? Could you talk about that process?
Sure, yeah. They were very common. The inaccuracies of vague 17th century deeds and grants that were written without precise knowledge of the land, all those inaccuracies were exposed as people started to move into that area. And there were enough ambiguities and inconsistencies in the deeds to provide opposing parties sufficient premise to twist interpretations to their benefit. New York pretty much had a controversy with every single one of their neighbors. Initially with Connecticut, that they resolved by agreement. A dispute with Massachusetts that was pretty much resolved by the Revolution, but it was still hanging on a little bit. A dispute with New Jersey that was resolved by agreement in 1773. And obviously the dispute with New Hampshire. Pennsylvania faced competing claims from Connecticut, Maryland, and Virginia. Some of these disputes were still unresolved at the time of the Revolution, and would linger into the 1780s and later. Connecticut would first give up its claims to the Pennsylvania regions, but it would hold on to its land in Ohio that was called the Western Reserve before finally handing that back over in the 1800. The conflict in the Hampshire grants remained very contentious, but that had the added variable that the settlers in Vermont declared independence themselves in 1777 and became the Independent Republic of Vermont. This dispute between Vermont and New York continued after the war and was finally resolved with a financial settlement and paved the way for Vermont to be admitted as the 14th state in the Union in 1791.
Okay, Bob. So in your article, we like to, of course, obviously highlight all the great work that you do. You really point to the Crown ruling of 1764 as kind of a tipping point early on for this dispute. Can you talk about that ruling, what it did?
Yeah, sure. This ruling is the conclusion of what I call phase one of this dispute. The dispute began in 1749 when New Hampshire Governor Benning Wentworth granted some land in the charter township of Bennington, which was far west of the Connecticut River, about 20 miles from the Hudson. Prior to this, the land that we call Vermont today was essentially an unsettled frontier region. With this step, New Hampshire was claiming the wilderness and claiming the western border on the 20-mile line, which was due north from the lines that Connecticut and Massachusetts had resolved with Massachusetts almost resolved with New York. New York would contest the claim. They would agree to submit their differences to the Board of Trade, and that the Board of Trade would rule. Well, what happened is the French and Indian War started. It pushed the dispute to the background. But during this time, Wentworth continued to grant townships. He was using it as political favors for those in New Hampshire. He ended up granting 130 townships by 1764 when the border ruling came through. And once the Treaty of Paris was signed, then the dispute was ripe for resolution. But by that time, New Hampshire had lost political support in London. Wentworth had previously had an ally in the Duke of Newcastle, who was the prime minister in the late 1750s and early 1760s. Their agent in London, John Tomlinson, had a close relationship with Newcastle. But that all changed when George III ascended to the crown when his father died. The government began to change. Newcastle was ousted. At the same time, Tomlinson died, and his son took over his role as agent for New Hampshire, and London. But he was beset with many illnesses and was unable to really discharge his duties very well while he was there. Wentworth became a target of investigation, and the support he previously had in London was gone. New York gained political support that New Hampshire had lost, and in 1764, the Crown set the border, and they set it at the Connecticut River.
Bob, can you talk a little bit about how the resistance to that ruling first develops?
Well, initially, New York accepted the. I'm sorry. Excuse me. Let me start over on this. New York had won the border dispute, but there were many people that were settled in New Hampshire under New Hampshire titles in the area. They had been improving their land. They were planning to bring families. Bennington already had 81 families located there. The border ruling failed to address the title issues that were created by the ruling. So all the people that had bought titles from New Hampshire and had settled there were kind of in limbo at the time. So what New York did is they acted on their perceived authority. They were told that was New York land, but they invalidated the New Hampshire titles and demanded that those who were settled there repetition New York and to pay a second time for patent fees, surveys, and higher quit rents. New York also issued new conflicting patents in the western region there, from Bennington up to Manchester. And this is the area that became the focal point for the settler resistance. The settlers recoiled at these actions. They petitioned the king, and the petition had the desired effect. The Crown quickly issued instructions and orders to New York not to harass the settlers who were there, who had New Hampshire titles, and for the governor not to make any more grants of land. So the Crown took over jurisdiction of the issue. It's important to note at this time that New York, which was then under the administration of Governor Henry Moore, initially acquiesced to these orders. So no more land was granted, and the settlers were not harassed. But during this time, Governor Moore was facing political pressure from the landed elite of New York. Just before his death, he talked about this pressure in a letter to Lord Hillsborough, who was the head of the Board of Trade. He mentioned that he had come under political attack for his interpretation of the prohibition on land grants, which the Board of Trade later confirmed was the correct interpretation. But he continued to hold the line against the pressure he was feeling. But that acquiescence to the Crown's jurisdiction ended shortly after his death. In September of 1769, he died after a 3-week illness. And at that point in time, James Duane, one of the founding fathers of our country, was one of the lead figures in the opposition to Moore's decisions and played a key part in the resistance to the Crown. Duane had been orphaned at a young age. He had been taken in by the Livingston family, raised on Livingston Manor. The Livingstons had extensive land holdings in New York, and Duane became part of the landed elite of the colony. He became a prominent lawyer, earning his reputation through cases representing the landed class of the colony. He eventually married a Livingston. But Duane had significant interests in the 1765 conflicting New York land patents. He had a 1/3 interest in the 26,000-acre Princetown patent, which conflicted with 3 New Hampshire townships. He also purchased a military grant that had been issued to Michael Schlatter, which was right in the middle of Bennington. Just a month after Moore's death, Duane initiated ejectment actions against 18 longtime settlers in this region. But there were other actions also underway that signaled a complete change in New York's approach to the grants and would be acts of defiance. First, the New York Council provided an interpretation to the governor that the 1767 order that prohibited land grants applied only to grants that were conflicting with New Hampshire townships. There were areas within Vermont that hadn't been chartered by New Hampshire. That was incorrect, but that's the interpretation that New York took at this time and increased the volume of problem in the area. Judge Robert Livingston, who presided over the injectment trials a year later, would be one of the first to receive one of these grants after they resumed land granting. And the granting activity continued from then on until the start of the Revolutionary War, and eventually expanded into grants which overlapped and conflicted with New Hampshire townships. These actions all coincided with a survey confrontation that's pretty well known. The New York survey teams were stopped by settlers at the 20-mile line when they were trying to survey the Walloomsac patent. There was a confrontation there. Arrest warrants were issued for a couple of the participants, including James Breckinridge. These were the actions that set the stage for the pivotal 1770 ejectment trials, which I refer to as Phase 3 of the dispute.
Yeah, Bob, you say in the article that the Crown, and this is a quote from you, admonishes New York very swiftly. Talk about how they do that and exactly why.
Okay. Well, they issued a variety of different instructions and orders initially after the petition. The Crown did not want New York to harass the settlers that were already on the land, who were there improving and cultivating the wilderness. Their desires were clearly expressed in multiple letters, instructions, and orders. The way the Crown looked at it is they gave governors land granting authority to promote development and especially to accommodate the poor and the industrious who would do the heavy lifting. There was a great power imbalance between the elite landed class of New York and those who settled in the Hampshire grants. The Crown found that New York had leveraged that disparity to their own benefit to the distress of the settlers. There were a number of criticisms that the Crown leveled at New York in this matter, and they expressed these criticisms in the strongest language. The abuses of power included regranting or repatenting lands that were already under settlement. And it's important to hear some of the language that they used in describing this. The board said, the settlers, quote, have sustained great injury and suffered great oppression by the irregular conduct of the governor and the Council of New York. Here we're talking great injury, great oppression, irregular conduct. They had been told back in 1767 to accept New Hampshire titles in clear and unambiguous language. They had been instructed not to harass the settlers because, quote, on account of territorial differences or disputed jurisdiction for whatever provinces the settlers may be found to belong, it should make no difference in their property. So clearly these actions that New York were taking were counter to what the Crown had instructed them to do. So the Crown came out with two reports, the Board of Trade 1771, 1772, which confirmed the originally stated instructions and penalized New York for their actions, a penalty which essentially negated the results of the ejectment trials. The settlers' New Hampshire titles would take precedent, and eventually the New Hampshire townships would be validated. All conflicting New York patents after 1764 were invalidated. New York admonished them for other actions too. They exhibited an institutional disregard for established land patenting rules set down by the Crown. There was a 1,000-acre per person limit. What they would do, and the Princetown patent is a perfect example. They had 26 names to patent 26,000 acres. As soon as the patent went through, that was sold to James Duane and two others. And again, the language they used in the admonition is interesting here. It's very strong. Lord Hillsborough said the scheme was, quote, an abuse of so gross and fraudulent a nature as it deserves the severest reprehension. Again, very strong language. They were also admonished for charging exorbitant fees on the patenting of lands, fees which most of the fees went to the governor, the attorney general, and the clerk of the council, all who had interests in land in the New Hampshire grants. So the two reports paint a very clear picture. New York had abused their authority, failed to follow instructions and orders, and they were admonished in the strongest terms and with blunt language. Yes.
Bob, how do we see the Crown settle a dispute like this? I mean, how does it ultimately shake out?
Well, what happens here is that New York obviously did not accept the findings of the Crown. They continued to lobby for a more favorable settlement as the clock continued to tick down to the Revolution from 1773 to 1775. I think it's pretty clear that other actions at the time were in play with keeping New York to the best they could loyal. After the ejectment trials, obviously this provoked a response from the settlers. They defended their land, and that's where the Green Mountain Insurgency began. But the situation in the grants had changed materially since the border ruling. There was additional immigration. Many people coming from Dutchess County after the land riots, some who had participated in the land riots. There was speculation going on. Ethan Allen showed up. Him and his clan were beginning to buy up New Hampshire titles. New York just was continually frustrated by the Green Mountain Boys and the attempts to assert law enforcement power in the region. Yorker settlers were harassed by the Green Mountain Boys, sometimes violently. And this struggle over land would continue. This insurgency continued to the Revolutionary War. And New York would continue to contest this land after the war. And it would take a financial settlement in the 1780s for them to move on, and that we could allow Vermont to come in as the 14th state at that time.
Bob, in your opinion, do you see any elements of this dispute trickling into the modern world? History has a funny way of reminding us that it's still there. Is this dispute gone, or do we still see it manifest at certain times?
Well, I think there's still remnants in how the history is portrayed to a degree. I think, when the other disputes that show up, you can look at the state of Connecticut, that little notch on the western border. That was a settlement from New York. Later on, in the early 1900s, there was a lawsuit between Vermont and New Hampshire about the border between the two. It was a tax dispute. New Hampshire was trying to collect taxes from the west side of the river, and it lasted 17 years. It went to the Supreme Court, and they even referenced the 1764 border decision in the Supreme Court opinion. We had border disputes here in Michigan. We gave up Toledo and got the Upper Peninsula. Didn't look like a good trade at the time, but I think it looks pretty good now.
Excellent. Bob, we always end with this question. It really gets to the heart of what we do as historians. How do you think this article helps us understand the Revolutionary Era better?
Well, a couple things jumped out to me. One was I began to understand what this deep-seated animosity was between New England and New York that showed up throughout the war, where New England troops were reluctant to serve under New York officers. It also provided a kind of a unique look at those in Vermont that remained loyal. Some of them did it for the purpose of thinking that the crown was going to validate their titles finally. So, these often violent land struggles were part of the mosaic of the period leading up to the Revolution. There was much acrimony between the colonies over land, which certainly added complexities to the relationships between the states as they tried to stay united against Britain. A great example of this continued animosity, it's another little known fact of the Revolution, is that in December of 1775, while Boston was under siege and American troops were ready to storm Quebec, the Pennsylvania and Connecticut militias engaged one another in the Wyoming Valley. This was not loyalists versus rebel, it was colony against colony. The Connecticut militia repelled the Pennsylvanians, and the area would be devastated by raiding loyalists and Iroquois before the war was over, but the land struggle between those two states would continue beyond the war.
Bob Walworth, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.